Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast and others of you are joining us on our digital platforms. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Tonight, the Boston mayoral race. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff and our guests are joining us remotely. Next week, Tuesday, Boston voters will head to the polls to vote for Boston's 55th elected mayor. From the beginning, the race has been historic, with 5 candidates of color in the primary election and the top winners, both women who identify as people of color. Either Michelle Wu or Annissa Essaibi-George will be the first mayor in 200 years who is not male or white. Have both candidates committed to policies that support communities of color, and will those communities see actual movement on issues impacting their safety and success? Joining us remotely, Dr. Paul Watanabe, professor of political science and director of the Institute for Asian American Studies at UMass Boston. Tanisha Sullivan, Esquire, president of the NAACP Boston branch and a member of the GBH Board of Advisors. Phillip Martin, senior investigative reporter, GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting, and Mehreen town councilor from Wakefield. Welcome to all of you. Paul, I'm going to start with you. I just would like a little breakdown on the racial demographics in terms of Boston voters. And I'd like you to answer the question whether voters of color can or will make the difference, I guess will make the difference in this election.
Well, I think they can in the sense that they're going to be added to what I think is going to be a fairly overwhelming judgment in favor of one of the 2 candidates, I think Michelle Wu. But in terms of the makeup of the city, we've often talked about it as a majority non-white city. But that's not true in terms of the electorate still. The electorate is still majority white. And to the extent that Black voters and Latino voters and Asian American voters do not or do turn out or don't turn out, it will have a big impact in terms of their say in the outcome ultimately. And based on the primary, about 1 in 4 Boston residents turned out for this historic election. Hopefully those numbers will increase substantially and they'll increase and at least maintain themselves in communities of color as well. There's a concern that that might not happen, and in some ways that might dampen the effect of this historic outcome that I think has really gripped the nation as well as the globe, really, in some respects, and hopefully it'll grab the attention of people who live in the city itself in terms of turning out for the election on Tuesday.
Tanisha, in a city, as Paul has just said, where the majority of residents are people of color, and in a race where race and identity are at the center of it, why is it that there hasn't been, if not an overwhelming response from communities of voters of color, but in general, just more interest?
Well, I think it is important to note that in the preliminary voting, the voter turnout was down writ large across all demographic groups. I do think it is important to look at communities of color and kind of where they lent their support. And overwhelmingly, they supported the women, first and foremost, who were in the race, and specifically leaned more toward Kim Janey and Michelle Wu in the prelim. As we're looking at the general election, I think what we're seeing is a recognition by communities across the city that this is indeed a historic election, but it is as much to do with the candidates and their policies as it has to do with trying to send a message about change and delivering a mandate of change in this city. And we see that certainly with the mayoral candidates, we see it with the city council candidates, and we're seeing it with the ballot questions as well.
Now, Mehreen, have we taken enough close look at the structural barriers that might be preventing some voters of color to actually casting a ballot?
I think that's increasing. We're getting better about it. So, we saw historic levels of people voting last year in the 2020 election. And because of the pandemic, the state and cities had put in remove some of the barriers to voting, right? So we saw early voting, we saw voting by mail, we saw, ballot boxes across the state, maybe not enough in the city of Boston, but all of those have increased this year, right? So we are going to have early voting started last Saturday. There's already been, it stops today, but I think over 10,000 people have chose to early vote. People are voting by mail. All of those things are to help people come out on election day or for the election. I think they help. That's not great. We also see more people pulling ballots in foreign languages, right? Not in English, which I think is important. It's all barriers to get people to vote. And until we have a day off for election in America, like we do in other countries, like other countries have, we have to kind of remove some of those barriers. The State House is working on a statewide bill to make some of those things permanent that have been really effective, to remove some of those barriers that populations that have those barriers to the ballot have had. I like to, as we talk about the historic nature of this election and having two women on the final ballot for mayor, it wasn't until 1919, so just over 100 years ago, that white women didn't have the right to vote. Never mind women of color. That took a lot longer, and so we're still removing some of those institutional barriers to voting.
And we should mention that you have personally endorsed Michelle Wu in this race, so that everybody knows that as well. Now, Phillip, I'm moving over to you because you've been on the street talking with a lot of people, and you're not convinced that the polls, the early ones, which show Michelle Wu with a huge lead, may be right.
Well, I think that Michelle Wu will likely win this race, but I think it's tightened. And that's anecdotal. We haven't seen any polling for a couple weeks now, and the last poll showed Michelle Wu up by 30 points. Extraordinary. But I think there's been some momentum in Essaibi-George's direction over the last few weeks. And I'm not simply talking about the political signs that you see up and down VFW and American Legion Highway in more conservative bastions of the city indicating support for George, but I'm looking at her television commercials, the ferocity of her debate position in the last three debates. I think she has been effective in those debates. Again, in terms of trying to tie Michelle Wu to a so-called vagueness in terms of her positions, and also what you're hearing on the streets, where people have been somewhat some people have been somewhat ambivalent, and less so over the last few weeks, over the last week rather, when I've spoken with them. So I think the race has tightened. Again, I think that Michelle Wu will likely win this race, but I'd be shocked if there is a 30-point difference between the candidates.
All right, let's talk about what's at stake for communities of color here. Paul, I'll start with you. What's at stake?
Well, I think everything is at stake for communities of color, because I think there's been a sense at Boston, and this is a traditional way that mayors have won and run in Boston, particularly white mayors, this notion that Boston is a pretty good place. It tends to work pretty well, and we need to make some changes around the edges every time we bring in a new mayor and continue as a mayor. And that is not what the sense is of Boston for community of color. It historically is a place where the poverty that we see, the inequities that we see in terms of income have persisted, in terms of inequities in terms of health and educational outcomes in sector have persisted. And for those people, they want to look for an election, I hope this year, of somebody who says we're going to understand that Boston is not a place that works for everybody. It's got to be a place that now works for everybody, and it's going to take some bold action to do so. And to the extent that either of these candidates, and I think both of them are actually attuned to this reality, at least now, that they understand that it's not a city that works for everybody. It never has been, and it never will be until we address some of these questions of, as you pointed out, of income inequality, of the quality of education in the schools, of health outcomes and housing, et cetera. Those are the agenda. They're the perennial agenda, and the extent to which that gets addressed, that will serve those communities that have been left out in the dark, I think, in Boston.
So what Paul says, Tanisha, both of the candidates have been pretty articulate about, hey, we know there's some differences. I don't think I've ever heard a race in Boston at this level where I've heard the expression people of color or the differences or their inequities. All of that language has certainly been used by both of them. So for you, with that as a sort of contextual background, what's at stake?
Look, everything's at stake. The issues haven't changed. What we're hoping to see with this particular election is that we will finally, in communities of color and across other communities, working class communities, lower income communities, we will finally actually experience change in our city and finally be able to have a city that doesn't just talk about being inclusive, but really a city where people across every demographic group actually experience a higher quality of life. At the end of the day—
Give me an example of what would be a change you'd like to see.
Well, I think we can look at education. We can start there with the Boston Public Schools. There is widely recognized that we need to see progress there. We've got, upwards of 60 to 70% of our children not receiving a high quality education through the Boston Public Schools. And we have for now years just really worked the edges on that issue. Really, I believe, working out of fear rather than pushing to make the change that needs to happen so that our kids can truly benefit from a high quality education here in Boston. Callie, at the end of the day, we talk a lot about innovation in this area, in this part of the country. What we need to see is not just, innovative ideas, but we do need breakthrough solutions to the inequality that we continue to see across the city. And so hopefully whoever the next mayor is, will be able to bring about that change, again, so that all of Boston can benefit from the prosperity that Boston has to offer.
Mehreen, what's at stake?
I think it's a really important election, like everyone said. I think all eyes are tuned into it. I think we are seeing what's happening across cities, across the state, across states, across the nation, where, we are still in the middle of a pandemic. We are in a public health crisis. We are in a climate crisis. We are in an economic crisis. And we need leaders who kind of had bold ideas to take those issues head on, whether it be criminal justice, whether it be climate reform, whether it be healthcare. And we have two candidates in Boston, these two final candidates who, have a different life experience than anyone before. And we are hearing more about them being women and their identities, being women of color, being children of immigrants, whether it be from, a child from a parent from Tunisia who is Muslim background, or a child of Taiwanese immigrants. Like, these are just different lived experiences. And they're bringing all of that to the table and with their ideas and their bold solutions. So I think everything's at stake. I think it really sets a tone. And I said this before, but what towns do, what leaders do in town, there's a ripple effect, right? So what I do in Wakefield and the policies that I work on to make my town more welcoming, to make it more inclusive, to get us through this public health crisis, other cities will do that. And people will look to what the next mayor of Boston is doing to address all these crises we're going through.
Phillip, what do you think the main thing is that it's at stake?
It's interesting. Well, Paul was saying something earlier about this having not just regional and national implications, but international. I think he's right. I find this race intriguing for a lot of reasons. One is when you look at the symbolism, for example. Essaibi-George is sort of associated with sort of an older, traditional, conservative, if you will, bent in terms of Boston politics. Wu exemplifies more of a progressive bent. And it's interesting also that Mehreen mentioned the term bold ideas. Wu is associated with bold ideas, ideas which Essaibi-George says are not solid, which are more pie in the sky. But they are ideas. And in a lot of ways, I see this race almost in a surrogate context. When you look at Wu, I think about Elizabeth Warren. When I think about Essaibi-George, in some ways, I think about Joe Manchin. These tensions within the Democratic Party. between conservative and more liberal progressive. And so I think that Boston represents something, what's at stake essentially is the image of the city. Is it status quo? In many ways, again, exemplified by Essaibi-George, particularly in terms of her embrace by the police unions? Or will it be Wu in terms of her, what some consider a more bold approach to a Boston that needs to change in terms of its racial complexity and history, and in terms of its economic position in this world of ours right now? And that economic position could be helped a lot by some of the funding that is coming through from the federal government associated with fighting the COVID crisis. The PPP funding that the legislature was discussing just this past week.
So, Paul, picking up on what Phillip said, is this race a referendum on Boston's image and reputation to some degree? Phillip mentioned political status. And does it matter to communities of color?
Yeah, I think Malia Lazu, who's a very well-known Africana Latina activist in town, says that this represents an election where Boston can be thought of more than busing in the Kennedys, and I agree with that. This is something that Boston is going to be thought of as important, and I think Michelle Wu, to Phillip's point, she has been all about change before even running for this office. Think about that. When she came in with Ayanna Pressley in the city council, the city council is considered this place where nobody goes and people go to sit and just do what the mayor asks in a strong mayor system. I think she gave some visibility to what the city council can mean. And now it's an active place where people of color and women and so forth are getting a say in city government. She decided to take on Mayor Walsh even before he decided to step away. That's really challenging change. That's calling for a big difference. And these ideas that she's talked about, like the Green New Deal applied to the local and the transportation, these are ideas that came to her before she was running for mayor. So she's putting a lot of stake in this idea of change. And it's a personal stake that she's going to make as well, both for herself and for women. Because I think a lot of people, I'm a person of color and she's a person of color, and Essaibi-George is as well. And I'm holding my breath, hoping they'll succeed as a person of color. And the women out there must think the same thing. Having the first elected woman mayor, that they want to see that she succeeds, because otherwise, if she is perceived as failing, it's going to have this impact. People are going to say, they're going to question whether a woman or a person of color can in fact succeed in this position. People are going to hold her to that standard. And I think that that's unfortunate, but it's a reality. So the stakes are great for a lot of us, for her personally, for the city of Boston, most importantly, and for this idea of change that Phillip talks about as percolating a bit on the streets out there. And to some extent, that change agenda and her particular fate is tied up with those of us who are people of color and women and so forth within the city of Boston.
Tanisha, how do you respond to that? Is this a referendum on Boston's image and reputation? And does it matter to communities of color specifically?
I think that remains to be seen. You know, certainly as a Black woman, I celebrate representation in government. And anytime we have these historic moments, I think it is important to celebrate that. However, at the end of the day, what matters most are the policies that any elected leader actually advances and implements. And so for me, what I'm going to be looking for is what happens in the 90 to 100 days following this historic election. What is going to actually change in and for the lives of Bostonians across the board, and specifically for and within communities of color? That is where I believe the referendum will come into play. That is where the history will truly be made. That is what that is how the conversation will change across the country as it relates to the city of Boston. And so again, for me, I'm going to be looking at the policy changes, the practices that change in the first 90 to 100 days to really see if indeed this election is going to actually mean change here in the city.
And we should note that the NAACP has already promised to reinitiate its report card on how the performance of the new mayor is with regard to the policies and that you just mentioned. Just where are they in terms of not only advancing certain ideas, but also making them real on the ground?
Absolutely. I think it's important for us as a community to hold our elected officials accountable for what they say and for what they do. It does matter what especially happens at the municipal level, because those decisions, those policies have a direct impact on the day-to-day lives of residents. And so looking at and monitoring what happens out of the mayor's office, out of the city council, that matters. And so that is something that we believe as a community is important for us to make a commitment to do.
Mehreen, does it matter if this is a referendum on Boston's image and reputation to communities of color?
I agree with what Dr. Watanabe and what Tanisha said. I think it is representation matters, right? Having people in government who look like the communities they serve is really important. I'm a graduate of the Emerge program that trains women to run for office. I think Tanisha is also a graduate of that program, and both Annissa and Michelle are graduates of that program. It's trained over 300 people in Massachusetts, women, to run for office. And women make up 51% of the population in America. We're about 25% of elected offices, and then only 7% of those are women of color. So we have a long way to go for equity. Each time we have candidates that make it to the ballot, it's a victory for representation. It's a victory to have people like me with my lived experiences, whether being a kid of immigrant, being a Muslim, being, South Asian, all of those, being a mom, being those lived experiences, having those on the candidate, that's a step for progress. It's a step towards equality. Of course, the policies within the 100 days without the term matters, but I do think that representation matters, and it's a step in the right direction.
Phillip, what would you add?
I was just I'm taken by Maureen's passion on that issue, and I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, I get excited about the notion of a woman becoming the 56th, mayor of Boston after such a long tradition. And I think, again, it does matter in terms of this notion of whether or not the city is transformational or whether or not it is status quo. And of course, no matter who wins, this is an extraordinary transformation. But it's a question of how great the city will be transformed. Will the situation at Melnia Cass and Mass Avenues, will that situation be addressed? The questions that Tanisha raised about people in their communities, will they feel that their situation, their lives have improved, are improving over the first 90, 100 days? I think that's absolutely important. The question of the exam schools. Will we continue with a system that is patently unfair, or will we usher in a new era of where the exam schools basically are open to everyone? Will affordable housing be extended to those folks that I was just referring to, not just at Melnia and Melnia Cass and Mass Avenue, but throughout the city where affordable housing is in fact absolutely needed in what now is the third most expensive city in the country after New York and San Francisco. Who becomes mayor is absolutely essential and critical in terms of addressing these issues and more.
So Paul Watanabe, what will you be looking for in these next few days that tells you A, who's likely to win, and B, what issue will probably have to be first addressed? I'm thinking it's Mass and Cass because that's really bubbled to the surface in very serious conversations between the two candidates. But as we know, early voting has already taken place, and that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think it is. And whomever wins, I think I'm going to be a little more generous than Tanisha and give them more than 90 to 100 days to decide. Because I think these problems that we've suggested and all of us have talked about have been there for generations in many cases. And the expectation that anybody, whether they be a woman or a woman of color or anybody, is going to come and be able to address them in a big way in that period of time, I think is almost setting them up in some ways for failure. But I do want to see a direction on these issues. I want to see a sense that the community as a whole is being heard and that their issues are being addressed in a new way, perhaps along the lines that Phillip is talking about. In that respect, I am looking for that sort of significant change. And in terms of mass and caste, or whether it's the income inequality, I think there are some things that have to be done immediately. I do think she's right about affordable housing, Michelle Wu, that there is a crisis and we got to put everything on the table, including the possibility of rent stabilization. I think in terms of income inequality, affordable housing, of course, will add to that, but there's a crisis right now. And I think we should consider providing a guaranteed income to people in the city of Boston, for example. That would be a way to really deal with some of the income inequality immediately in the city of Boston. In terms of mass and caste and so forth, there are some immediate solutions. We can build the bridge there, but that's going to take forever. We're going to have to find a ways to ferry people to Long Island, for example. That's going to take days to put that into place. And those sorts of solutions. So there's short and long-term things that you mentioned. And I think the long-term things are the things that are going to be the real thing, the direction we're going to have to see in the next few days.
Well, that's a perfect ending for our broadcast and the end of our show. I want to thank all of our guests for joining us and thank all of you for watching. Stay with us now as we continue our conversation online on our digital platforms, Facebook and YouTube. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. We are on Facebook and YouTube with our post show, continuing our discussion on the Boston mayoral race. Paul, I need to circle back with you for just 1 second about what has already been stated by voters, whether they be voters of color or not, as the #1 issue for them, and that's housing. So and it's one of the issues you just mentioned has been fairly intractable. Well, let me make that clear. Affordable housing. Mm-hmm. So I don't, how do they even begin to start to make some appreciable difference in this, right out of the gate? Both of them have said, hey, we've been sitting on this city council, we've been in it, we know these issues, and we're coming out ready to go. In other words, we don't have to have the ramp up time. Mm-hmm. So what would be your expectation that would demonstrate a serious change in direction with regard to housing?
Well, it's all the plans to provide mechanisms by people to provide mortgages and so forth. And it's actually to build more affordable housing, to really require it in terms of when we build large buildings in the city, that we put aside larger sums of the territory in those projects for affordable housing. But in the short term, I think you're right. It's not, people aren't going to immediately going to be able to come up for money with large mortgages and so forth, and we're not going to be able to build the housing that's necessary in the short term. So we're going to have to provide some income for them, and most of the people of color in the city of Boston are renters as well, and we're going to have to not say to them, if you're impacted by the pandemic, that you're going to be evicted, and we don't care about that. We're going to have to continue those sorts of possibilities. And we're going to have to do all these sorts of things for the city of Boston residents in terms of trying to get through this immediate crisis. And the long-term possibility, of course, is affordable housing. But affordable housing is directed by one thing, and that is the ability of people to have money in their pocket to invest in this affordable housing, no matter at what level. And that, I think, is the biggest concern that I have. Putting money in people's pockets is the key to, I think, moving ahead.
Mm-hmm. Tanisha, is there something that you could point to that could begin to push in a direction of, not, you can't resolve is a huge word, but at least begin to approach some improvement in the area of affordable housing?
Absolutely. And I need to go back to Paul's last comment in the previous segment. I am very concerned that if we do not elect a mayor who is ready to hit the ground running day one. Both of these candidates have been at-large city councilors for nearing a decade. They both know the issues, or at least should know the issues, and have been working towards solutions, or at least should have been working towards solutions as city councilors. These issues are not new. Whether we're talking about the lack of affordable housing, high quality education, the lack of economic opportunity, climate resilience, the list goes on. These are not new issues. It is deeply concerning to me at this point in the campaign cycle that we have not heard from either of the candidates concrete solutions, breakthrough solutions that they would seek to start implementing day one on many of these issues. And so when we talk examples of what could be commitments from both of the candidates, when it comes to economic opportunity, a commitment day one to change the procurement practices of the city of Boston. It is reprehensible that we continue to have lack of opportunity for business owners of color in accessing city contracts. That could be done day one through executive order. We could have a commitment from both of the candidates day one to support structural changes as it relates to our school committee. There's a question on the ballot regarding an elected school committee. We have not received a commitment from both candidates, from either candidate, as it relates to that issue. And similarly so, we could have a commitment from both of them day one as it relates to public health and the changes that we need to see in the city as it relates to tackling the social determinants of health, which would include high quality, access to high quality, affordable housing, which would include commitments from both candidates as it relates to prioritizing people in this fight for climate justice. People alongside place as it relates to climate justice. So there are things that they could do day one, commitments they could make day one that would have a positive impact on the residents of the city of Boston within the first 90 to 100 days. And that is what I'm hoping for, whoever is elected next week.
Mehreen, with regard to affordable housing, what should be happening to demonstrate this is a new day by whomever wins?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be done executive order. The affordable housing crisis is not new. It's not just a Boston problem, but being the third most expensive city, it is a problem. I think we have to, whoever becomes mayor needs to continue some of the helping people with evictions that Mayor Walsh started and Mayor Janey continued. We need to continue helping people out of situations. I also think you briefly touched on Mass and Cass. I mean, somebody needs to invest in substance abuse programs and mental health programs, and we need to see some of that money coming from the Fed. I think there's over $500 million that Boston, the mayor and the city council are going to figure out where that money gets allocated and how do we get out of these crises, like I mentioned before. So I think there are things that in day one by executive order, working with a city council, this new mayor is going to have a city council with, I think, 6 new members, right? At least 6 new members. And again, are really diverse, lots of potential mayors with different lived experiences, city councilors of color, excuse me. And so working as a team, I think, there's a lot. The mayor is the leader in charge, but there will be a new city councilor to help implement some of these ideas and tackle these problems. And, you want someone who deals with these things as a team. There's only so much one person can do.
I will point out that in that wholesale change you mentioned on the city council, there's been, it appears anyway, from a demographic voter situation, that there's a lot of interest in the city council races, which is fascinating, that doesn't seem to have translated to the mayor's race. And that's the one that we're all like, this is historic, this is big, this is whatever. Everybody else knows it. Why is that generating the same kind of excitement here? I'll let y'all deal with that in a minute, but I just want to point that out before, Phillip, you weigh in on this day one affordable housing.
Well, day one, I think that the procurement that Tanisha was talking about, I think that should be demonstrated. And there's a way of demonstrating that combined with the need for housing. I think that if the new mayor finds herself with all this money coming from the federal government, yes, I think obviously she cannot act arbitrarily. She will negotiate with the state legislature. But a lot of that money should be, in her view, directed toward building new housing almost immediately, determining where that new housing will be built, and having contractors who are people of color proportionally represented on those projects and in terms of the businesses that handle those projects, as we've been actually talking about in our series, The Color of Public Money at GBH Center for Investigative Reporting. And I think a symbolic step also that would be extraordinary for the people of Boston to see this, because mass and caste has been such a visible and is such a visible issue. The notion of going in and directing money toward mental health programs immediately, towards substance abuse programs that work immediately, and finding a regional solution. The mayor of Boston doing what the governor has not done, frankly, which is the governor's talked about a regional approach, but has not really sat down with the leaders of Cambridge and with Revere and other communities directly affected by this. Once people leave mass and caste, they don't simply sail off into, into the nether, into nowhere land. They go across the bridge to Cambridge, or they go into Revere, or they go into other communities. And so if we have a mayor that actually sits down with other mayors, other leaders in this area to address this issue, and that is seen, then that is viewed concretely. People realize that this is a mayor who is basically seeking a solution and not simply talking about the problem. And that's not to cast aspersions on anyone, by the way. I think the notion of trying to, when we had the situation when negotiated a few weeks ago, where homeless and addicted people were going to go to a hotel in Revere, well, that ideally it might be a great idea, but it requires a lot of discussion regionally among city leaders. Boston could lead the charge.
So let me ask a question that comes up. Certainly we see it in the corporate space, and to some degree we've seen it in other places politically, and that is, so there's a huge historic change at the top with a person of color in leadership. But you can't make any of these moves that you've talked about unless you have some support in some of the other folks who are in political positions to support you. Mm-hmm. In fact, we're seeing nationally that one or two people can shut the whole thing down. And that often we have seen in corporate situations and in other political situations where just the mere fact of that person being a person of color in a role that they've never been in before, or the whole city and community has never seen them before, necessarily ends up meaning that they don't get some of the built-in kind of support from institutions that in the past may have. So I guess I'm asking, that's a roundabout question of saying, you get the job, and then if you don't get the support, you get blamed for it, as Paul Watanabe says, but you're effectively stymied, even though you are in position to try to do something. How do you see this playing out in Boston? Are you worried about that? I guess is my question to you, Tanisha.
I think it's...
Go ahead, Paul.
I think it's clear that people should not get blamed, but they should also get the credit. I think Kim Janey, for example, there's some things to build upon that she talked about in terms of what Tanisha's talked about. Her Health Equity Now agenda, I think, is something that the city should look forward to, and all the candidates should look forward to the building on. Our one experience with a Black woman of color as mayor has been a good one in some respects. She's learned on the job, but I think she's left a good legacy on a lot of these fronts. And if you think about the people who make a difference in the city, yes, you're right. It used to be people at the vault and so forth. But now I think the most powerful person in Boston, a person who could have made a big difference in terms of the primary election and the possibility of getting us a Black woman candidate of color, was Ayanna Pressley. I think, for example, if Pressley would have endorsed somebody in the primary, the possibility is that we might have, in fact, had somebody other than Essaibi-George as a finalist in that election. So if we think about the city of Boston, the way the power is being distributed now, you're absolutely right. There's these traditional sort of sectors, but things are changing a bit. And that's the importance of this. There's no question that Michelle Wu or Essaibi-George, if they're elected, are going to be a new kind of voice. They're not going to be the traditional one. Ayanna Pressley has shown the power of that, and other people are going to show the power of that. There are people, for example, in the Black leadership effort in King Boston and so forth. They're having an impact on the city of Boston. And people, frankly, in the media like you and other people like Phillip Martin and people like that who are in the media, they're people of color, and they're having an impact now like they've never had before. And I think that's how you bring about change. You got to change the position of these people. You got to give them a chance. And when they succeed, we got to say that they're succeeding and push them forward. Kim Janey was not a failure by any means. I think she was a great interlude for 5 months as our mayor, in my view.
Weigh in, Tanisha.
So I do want to just make a declarative statement that we have two finalists in the mayor's race, both of them highly qualified, both of them incredibly competent, both of them having demonstrated strong leadership up to this point. And I have no doubt that whoever is elected next week will be an outstanding mayor, okay? The question is for who? Right? And for what part of our city? And so it is my hope, again, that to Paul's point, that both whoever's elected will receive credit for helping to move our city forward, while at the same time that we hold whoever is elected accountable when they are falling short. And again, as women, I know we're talking about people of color, but I want to celebrate that these are women, as women who are really now positioned to lead this city. I am excited about that. And I hope that as a city, we will be able to embrace the leadership of a woman and the leadership of someone who identifies as a person of color moving forward.
Do you worry about those traditional sources of support not being there for them?
Absolutely. Look, Callie, as a Black woman, you know, that is my lived experience, right? Is that we can't count on that traditional support, which is why the grassroots community support is going to be critically important. It is important for us, regardless of what leadership roles we sit in. We cannot rely on historical structures of power. And so that means that there's going to be an even larger role for us as a community, for us as residents of Boston, for those of us who are stakeholders in the city, to make sure that we are supporting whoever the next mayor ends up being, so that we can create, in so doing, that we are creating really a new power structure, and one that is recognizing and appreciating and respecting the voice of all of Boston, and that's grassroots to grass tops.
Mehreen.
Completely agree. I think you're not going to change power dynamics that have long been held overnight. But what is changing is removing voting barriers, getting different people to vote. I have been so impressed this election cycle. And I'm going to push back. I think there is a lot of interest in the mayor's race, right? The LA Times is covering this.
That's national. That's national.
It is.
I mean local. Go ahead.
But the number of forums, right? The number of local mosques having forums and local churches and community groups getting together and having debates and giving out questionnaires on these topics that are important to people. I think all candidates, mayors and the city council candidates, are building up these voters first-time voters, new voters, and the responsibility now is on the voters to hold the candidates accountable once they win. And I've seen that in my local races in my town. You can't forget about your voters, and to change power dynamics, to go against establishment, which again, all these candidates are doing. If you're not traditional, women again are not usually traditional candidates for mayor. People of color, Black women, Asian women are not usually candidates. We are changing the power dynamic. And so I think I agree with everyone that, change is not easy, that change is hard, but it's easier each time somebody shatters a little bit of that glass ceiling. And as mentioned, Congressman Presley did it 3 years ago. And I think that makes it easier for other people, but voters have to hold them accountable. And that's going to be reminding them. Coming up with a candidate or a mayor report card is a great step, republishing those questionnaires and those forums. Have you committed to this? I think the candidates are impressed of when they go to, those local forums, what questions they're getting asked that we weren't asked these questions 10 years ago. You know what? Why is Planned Parenthood Advocacy Fund asking about climate change? Why is this organization asking about transportation when you're a public health organization, right? And we as voters and individuals understand the intersectionality. It's our lived experience. And I think now candidates understand that they need to respond to that.
Phillip, you get the last word.
I was just thinking about all the debates that have happened over the last few weeks between the candidates. They've been all over the place in terms of communities, including a recent debate that was hosted by Chip Greenwich in Dorchester. And it was focused on nightlife and the notion of how do you change the nightlife of Boston. And I'm just thinking about that as just one of the many challenges that these candidates are dealing with that we might not have thought about in a traditional race, if you will. And so however this turns out, I think we're talking about something that is so different, so transformational. On one hand, you have the Boston Herald endorsing Essaibi-George. You have the Boston Globe endorsing Michelle Wu. And so we see the counter positions exhibited and exemplified by these candidates.
But do you worry about the sources of support that have traditionally been there not being there for them?
Well, if you think about one source of support, for example, for Essaibi-George, which is the police unions, well, that source will certainly not be there, if you will, for Michelle Wu. There will be tensions from the very beginning between the police unions and Michelle Wu, and not so for Essaibi-George. And I think that in many ways is fine because because I think what we have to talk about, and one of the issues that we're dealing with is police reform. And I think that Michelle Wu, if she becomes the mayor of Boston, will in fact deal with that issue. And that is an issue that is of concern to a lot of people. Essaibi-George will deal with the concerns about rising crime, if you will, or perceived rising crime. And I think however they deal with it, they're going to leave some people out in terms of concerns that they are not, if you will, addressing the issue that's of paramount concern to them. Policing is one thing. Another issue, of course, will be housing. Essaibi-George's husband's connection to developers, his own projects, and Michelle Wu's declaration that affordable housing is paramount and rent control may be and should be on the table in that context. Someone's going to be left out. There will be tensions as a result of these polar positions, if you will.
Well, I thank you all for joining me, and I'm sure we'll be talking again on the other side of the election. Thanks very much.